They thought it was going to be just another case, just another teenager with sagging jeans, a blank stare, and a rap sheet longer than his resume. The courtroom was full, but no one was really paying attention. Not at first. After all, what was there to see? Another grand theft auto charge. Another kid who couldn't stay out of trouble. Los Angeles County Courthouse had seen it all before. Or so they thought. But then he looked up, and in that one small moment, chin lifted, eyes steady, and something changed. Not in the record, not in the official transcript, but in the air. The shift was so subtle it nearly slipped by unnoticed, but it was there. A tightening, a silence that wasn't there before. He was standing alone, no flashy suit, no lawyer at his side. Just a hoodie, jeans, and a calm so disarming it felt like arrogance. His name was Jalen Dawson, 19, charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest. But what no one in that room realized was that Jalen Dawson wasn't the story's defendant. He was the twist. Judge Walter Grayson, silver hair slicked back, sat elevated behind the polished bench like a king observing his court. He wasn't a man easily surprised. Decades on the bench had carved out all the softness, all the hesitation. He'd seen murderers cry and saints lie. To him, Jalen was just another file in a stack, another number in the system. Grayson leaned back, his fingers tapping a slow, bored rhythm on the oak desk. The room waited. "So," the judge said, eyes peering over wire-rimmed glasses, "you think you're some kind of legal expert?" There it was. The first blow. Not a question. A dismissal wrapped in sarcasm. A few quiet chuckles broke out across the room. The stenographer, the bailiff, even the prosecutor smirked like they were in on a private joke. The gallery, rows of strangers, spectators, nodded along with amusement. The image was clear. A cocky teenager about to get torn apart by the law. But Jalen didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He didn't even blink. And that stillness, that absolute stillness, was the first real warning sign, because Jalen Dawson had waited years for this moment. Not this exact courtroom, not this exact judge, but this confrontation, this moment of underestimation. While his classmates had memorized the names of rappers and ball players, Jalen had memorized Miranda rights. While they played Grand Theft Auto on game consoles, Jalen had read real criminal reports for fun. He had been studying this system from the inside out since he was old enough to sit beside his mother's desk. Denise Dawson, a veteran paralegal, used to come home every night with stories of rushed judgments, of deals made behind closed doors, of defense attorneys who didn't fight hard enough. He listened. He remembered. He prepared. He never imagined he'd be standing here as the accused. But now that he was, he didn't intend to play the victim. He was here to make the system see itself, clearly, painfully, for the first time in a long time. Judge Grayson flipped open the file with a sigh that said he was already over it. "Let's make this quick. I've got a golf game at 2. More laughter. But something flickered on Jalen's face. A twitch, a smile, not wide, not smug, just precise. Because in that careless sentence, Grayson had just made his first mistake. And Jalen? He was about to make his first move. Reveal Jalen's background and intelligence subtly. Deepen contrast between how he's perceived and who he truly is. Plant seeds of the twist. The truth is, Jalen Dawson didn't belong in that courtroom, at least not on the side he was standing. But to understand why, you had to look past the hoodie, the youth, and the charges. You had to look back to the long nights spent at the kitchen table with his mother's worn-out law books, to a small apartment where justice wasn't some abstract principle, but something you had to outthink if you wanted to survive it. Jalen's mother, Denise Dawson, was a paralegal for over 2 decades. She wasn't rich, wasn't famous, but she was sharp, razor sharp, and she made sure her son inherited every edge she had to give. She'd bring home red-lined case files and tell him, "See this? This attorney didn't file discovery. In time. That's how they lost the case." He'd soak it in. He didn't just listen, he dissected. She'd quiz him over dinner. Chain of custody. What does that mean? Reasonable doubt. How would you define it? At 13, Jalen could hold his own in a conversation with seasoned defense lawyers. At 14, he could spot procedural errors just from reading summaries. At 15, he was writing mock arguments for cases he made up in his head. This wasn't a hobby. It was preparation. But the world didn't see that. The world saw a black teenager in a courtroom, and when they looked at him, they didn't see potential. They saw a problem. Judge Grayson didn't know any of this. Neither did Carrington, the prosecutor. They just saw the hoodie, the confidence, the defiance, and they made their own assumptions. What they didn't realize was that Jalen had been watching them longer than they'd been watching him. He knew how Carrington operated. He knew the prosecution's rhythms, the default strategies, the quiet ways they pushed juries in one direction without saying a word. He knew how judges like Grayson worked, who they favored, how quickly they dismissed defendants who didn't know how to speak their language. He had studied them all like chess openings. He wasn't here to plead. He wasn't here to beg. He was here to outmaneuver them. Jalen once told his mother, "If I ever end up in a courtroom, I want to be the one asking the questions, not answering them." Denise had smiled at the time, not realizing how prophetic those words would become. And now here he was, 19, on trial, and more prepared than anyone in that room knew how to handle. This wasn't the story of a lost kid. This was the story of a mind trained in shadows, in silence, to see the fault lines in a system designed not to notice kids like him. Most defendants walk into a courtroom hoping for a good lawyer. Jalen walked in knowing he didn't need one. He had already mapped every move, every weak point, every loose thread in the prosecution's case. All he had to do was wait for the right moment to start pulling, and it was coming, fast. Introduce Carrington as a confident, polished antagonist. Lay out the supposedly airtight case against Jalen. Increase pressure. Mitchell Carrington walked into the courtroom like it was a Broadway stage, and he was the star of a sold-out show. There was no rush in his steps, no nerves in his voice, just the confidence of a man who had delivered this same performance 100 times and won every standing ovation. His suit looked expensive, but not flashy. His hair was neat, tie perfectly knotted. His posture spoke volumes before he even opened his mouth. This was someone who'd never questioned whether a courtroom would take him seriously. He'd been handed the benefit of the doubt before he ever earned it. Carrington barely acknowledged Jalen, just a passing glance as if looking at a smudge on an otherwise clean desk. Then he turned to the judge with a tone that balanced reverence and command. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was apprehended in direct connection with the theft of a 2022 Audi A6. He began pacing slowly, deliberately. Every word was crisp, intentional. The vehicle had been reported stolen only hours prior. Officer Ruiz observed the suspect behind the wheel. A pursuit followed through downtown. The defendant attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were recovered from the steering wheel. He turned and finally gave Jalen his full attention. "The evidence," he said smoothly, "speaks for itself." And just like that, the room shifted. The jury nodded. The gallery whispered. Judge Grayson arched one skeptical brow, half convinced already. It was a textbook takedown, and Carrington knew it. He didn't stop there. He moved toward the jury, each step slow and calculated, like he was building rhythm, not just walking. "Now, the defense may try to convince you that Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of confusion or profiling," he said, his voice dropping just enough to sound sincere. But what kind of victim runs from the police? It wasn't just a question. It was a verdict disguised as logic. A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery coughed, trying not to laugh. Carrington returned to the prosecution's table and lifted a thin file. In addition to the physical evidence, the prosecution submits the sworn testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel. He closed the folder with a satisfying click. It sounded like a final nail in a coffin. To the courtroom, it all seemed too clear to contest. The puzzle pieces fit. The picture was ugly, but complete, but not to Jalen. Because while Carrington paced and performed, Jalen watched, not passively, strategically. He caught every flicker of overconfidence, every too-rehearsed phrase, every subtle shift in tone when Carrington mentioned the evidence that should have spoken for itself. Jalen had seen this performance before. He had studied it, analyzed it, rehearsed counter-moves in his head for years. This wasn't the first time he'd seen a prosecutor treat a trial like theater, but it would be the first time the audience, the court, saw what happens when the script breaks, because Jalen wasn't playing his role. He was rewriting the story. Deliver the twist, Jalen chooses to represent himself. The moment the courtroom shifts from mockery to unease. The courtroom was still buzzing from Carrington's confident performance when Lisa Thornton, the overworked public defender, slowly rose from her seat. Her expression was tight, her posture hesitant. Not because she doubted Jalen's innocence, but because she knew the game was rigged. She'd played on this field too many times with too little to show for it. She adjusted. Her glasses opened her mouth to speak, and felt a gentle hand on her arm. She turned, startled. Jalen didn't say a word. He just looked at her and gave a small, respectful nod. Lisa hesitated, then, almost in relief, lowered herself back into her seat. Jalen turned to the judge. His voice, when it came, was calm, clear, and controlled. "Your Honor," he said. "I'll be representing myself." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was stunned. For a beat, no one reacted. Then, "You'll what?" Judge Grayson blinked over his glasses, the corners of his mouth twitching in disbelief. Even Carrington snorted. "This should be good." But no one was laughing when Jalen took a step forward. There was something about the way he moved. Deliberate, unhurried, unafraid. That made the courtroom forget how young he looked. His hands were still in his pockets, his face unreadable. But his eyes, they were watching everything. "Before I begin," Jalen said, turning slightly toward the prosecution's table, "I'd like to clarify a point made by the state." Carrington crossed his arms. "Go ahead. You said Officer Daniel Ruiz witnessed me behind the wheel of the stolen Audi, correct?" "Yes," Carrington replied, already bored. "That's what his report says." Jalen nodded. "And that testimony is part of the evidence submitted?" "It is." Jalen paused, then turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony." Grayson leaned forward, skeptical. "On what grounds?" Jalen took his hands out of his pockets for the first time and pointed calmly toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact," he said, letting the words fall slowly, "he wasn't even on duty when the chase started." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Carrington straightened, his smirk vanishing. "Excuse me? I'd like to request the officer's GPS logs for the time of the alleged sighting," Jalen continued. "If he claims to have seen me, then his location history should back that up." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. The implication hit like a brick to the face. Carrington's pause was just a second too long, and in that second, everything changed. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. And most importantly, Judge Grayson noticed. The smug air in the room deflated as Grayson turned to Carrington. "Counselor, do you have any objections to verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Carrington cleared his throat. "Your Honor, that report was filed by a sworn officer of the law. Are we really going to let a defendant?" Grayson cut him off. "That's not what I asked." Carrington clenched his jaw, another beat. "No objections." But the damage was done. A courtroom that had just moments ago been chuckling at a cocky teen was now holding its collective breath. Because Jalen wasn't bluffing. He wasn't grandstanding. He was dissecting, unraveling, and he was just getting started. He turned back to the jury. Calm, still measured. "I'm not saying the officer lied," he said. I'm saying the truth deserves to be verified. That's what justice is, right? Someone in the gallery nodded without realizing it. Carrington scrambled to regain footing. Regardless of Officer Ruiz's location, the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. That, Your Honor, is irrefutable. Jalen didn't flinch. That's true, he said simply, but context matters. He turned back to the jury, walking slowly, making deliberate eye contact. Imagine walking into a store and trying on a jacket. You zip it up, you put your hands in the pockets, then you leave it on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone steals that jacket. Would your fingerprints on it mean you committed the theft? A few jurors glanced at each other. That Audi was parked outside a 7-Eleven the night it was stolen, Jalen continued. I was inside that store with 3 friends. When we came out, I leaned on the car. I even opened the door. It was already unlocked. I didn't drive it. I didn't take anything. But I touched it. That's what they're using against me. He let the silence settle. Does touching something make you a criminal? The air in the courtroom had shifted again. And this time, it wasn't shifting back. Grayson leaned back in his chair, visibly unsettled. Carrington looked like someone who had prepared for a debate and found himself in a chess match. And Jalen, he was just warming up. Unravel the prosecution's key evidence. Use logic and analogies to dismantle the fingerprint claim. Show Jalen's methodical brilliance. Yes, my prints were on the car. Jalen let the admission hang in the air, deliberately not softening it. He wanted them to hear it. Every juror, every spectator. Especially the prosecutor who had leaned so heavily on that point like it was gospel. But let's talk about what that really means. He turned toward the jury box, walking slowly, his steps unhurried, not pacing nervously, moving deliberately like someone flipping pages in a book he'd already read before. Let's say you walk into a department store, he began, voice calm. You try on a jacket, slip your hands into the pockets, maybe you even zip it up, then you put it back on the rack and walk out. Later that day, someone shoplifts that same jacket. He paused, eyes sweeping the jurors. Your fingerprints are still on it. Does that mean you stole it? A few heads tilted. One juror furrowed her brow, another leaned forward. You touched it. That's a fact. But touch isn't theft. Curiosity isn't a crime, and fingerprints, without context, are just traces, not truth. Across the room, Carrington shifted in his chair. Jalen wasn't done. The Audi, he said, gesturing to the file on the prosecution's table, was parked outside a 7-Eleven. That's where I was that night. Inside, with 3 friends. I came out, leaned against the car, the door was unlocked, I opened it. Didn't go inside, didn't drive off, just touched it. Another pause. This one longer. He was letting the moment breathe. Was it dumb? Maybe. But was it criminal? He looked each juror in the eye. That's what they want you to decide, based not on evidence of a theft, but on evidence that I touched something. Grayson shifted in his seat for the first time in minutes. It wasn't much, but it was something. An involuntary motion, a crack. Carrington stood suddenly. Your Honor, the fingerprints are on the steering wheel. Jalen held up a hand, not in defiance, but in invitation. I'm glad you brought that up, he said. Let's talk about that evidence. He turned back to the judge. Your Honor was the forensic specialist who analyzed those prints subpoenaed to testify? Grayson blinked, thrown off. He looked at Carrington. The prosecutor hesitated. Too long. No, he finally admitted. Jalen nodded, just once, as if confirming something he already knew. So let me get this straight, he said. The state wants to convict me based on forensic science, but didn't think it was important to bring in a forensic scientist to explain it? Silence. Jalen stepped closer to the jury, not aggressively, intentionally. Let me explain why that matters, he said. When fingerprints are processed, there are protocols, specific steps, chain of custody, environmental conditions. All of these can affect the reliability of the match. He glanced at the judge again. But because the technician isn't here, I can't ask if the scene was contaminated. I can't ask how many partial prints were found. I can't ask how they ruled out other people who might have touched the car. I can't even ask what kind of surface they pulled the prints from. He turned back to the jury. Calm. Measured. So what you've been given isn't science. It's a conclusion. And you're being asked to trust that conclusion without being allowed to question the person who made it. Grayson rubbed his temples. He wasn't laughing anymore. No one was. Carrington clutched his file like it could somehow protect him. And, still, Jalen pressed on. Not with arrogance, but with quiet, surgical precision. They've made my fingerprints the centerpiece of their case. But fingerprints don't prove motive. They don't prove action. They prove one thing: contact. He stopped, then added slowly, contact without context is nothing. The room was still. Even the gallery, once full of quiet murmurs, now sat motionless, listening, because they weren't watching a defendant anymore. They were watching a dismantler, a kid who came in wearing a hoodie and was now taking apart a courtroom, one lie, one assumption, one piece of evidence at a time. Drop the final bomb, the real owner's statement. Introduce race and identity mismatch, the moment of truth. Jalen took a slow step back from the jury box, the silence around him pressing like static. He'd picked apart the prosecution's case piece by piece, the officer's testimony, the fingerprint evidence, the absence of forensic accountability, and still, the courtroom clung to a sliver of doubt. Until now. He reached into the thin folder he'd carried from the start. No briefcase, no leather-bound binder, just a handful of papers, carefully chosen, quietly devastating. Your Honor, he said, voice steady. I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the registered owner of the vehicle in question, a Mr. Raymond Whitaker. Judge Grayson adjusted his glasses, curiosity flickering behind the tired mask he wore. The same Mr. Whitaker, Jalen continued, who called the police the night his car was stolen, the same man whose words were taken down by officers, and then quietly left out of the prosecution's file. He held the paper up between two fingers. It wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. Carrington paled slightly. Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers that night? Jalen asked, eyes locked on the prosecutor. Carrington didn't answer. He didn't need to. The way his jaw tensed said enough. Jalen unfolded the document and began to read. I left my Audi running when I ran into the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off with it. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a shiver down a spine. Grayson leaned back slowly in his chair. Someone in the gallery whispered, a stunned, what? Jalen raised the statement. This was part of the original police report, but the prosecution didn't mention it. The arresting officer didn't bring it up in his testimony. And no one, not one person, thought the jury should hear it. He turned to the judge. They knew the description didn't match. They knew the real suspect was white, but I'm the one they arrested. A black teen walking home from the 7-Eleven. Another beat of silence. Then Jalen added softly, I wasn't even near the vehicle. I wasn't running. I was with friends, carrying snacks. The only thing that tied me to this car was my skin and a fingerprint on a door I never closed. He stepped back, letting the truth echo. This isn't about guilt, he said. It's about assumptions. Carrington stepped forward abruptly, flustered. Your Honor, the defendant was found near the abandoned vehicle. No, I wasn't, Jalen said, sharp but measured. The vehicle was left near a park. I was arrested blocks away, on foot. There was no hot pursuit, no confrontation, no steering wheel in my hand. Just me, walking, breathing, existing. He paused. That was enough. The courtroom didn't move. Even the bailiff had stopped shifting. Judge Grayson exhaled, long and slow, as if letting go of the idea that this was ever a simple case. Jalen looked at the jury one last time. I studied this system because I believed it could work. I believed that if I understood it, respected it, followed its rules, it would protect me. But what do you do when the rules aren't the problem? He didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't cry. He didn't need to. Because the facts had done what emotions couldn't. They'd left no room to hide. The real thief had vanished into the night. But the system, eager, tired, hungry for closure, had found a stand-in. They found Jalen. Because he was nearby. Because he was convenient. Because he fit. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his hands folded, his face unreadable. Does the prosecution have anything further? Carrington shook his head, not because he was conceding, but because there was nothing left to fight with. The truth was standing right in front of them, calm, unshaken, wearing a hoodie. Deliver resolution. Grayson dismisses the case. The system is forced to look at itself. Emotional payoff. For a moment, no one in the courtroom moved. Carrington stood frozen, a man whose argument had collapsed around him. The folders in his hands were just paper now, no longer evidence, no longer weapons. The weight of his silence said more than any objection ever could. The jury didn't look at him. They looked at Jalen. Judge Grayson tapped a pen against the edge of his bench, slowly. Like a clock counting down the end of something, he leaned back, his face lined with something that wasn't quite shame, but wasn't far from it either. Case dismissed, he said quietly. No gavel, no speech, just two words that cracked the courtroom open like thunder. A collective gasp erupted across the gallery. Then chaos. Reporters scribbling, camera shutters snapping, people rising from their seats trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Voices layered over voices, disbelief, confusion, sudden applause. But through it all, Jalen didn't move. He stood still, the same way he had at the beginning, calm, quiet, composed, because this wasn't surprise for him. This was inevitability. He turned to leave. But just as he reached the back of the courtroom, Judge Grayson spoke again. His voice was different this time. Stripped of ego, of authority, almost human. Mr. Dawson. Jalen stopped. He didn't turn around. Grayson hesitated, the pause stretching longer than it needed to. Then finally, you should consider law, school. There was no laughter this time, no smugness. Just a quiet suggestion from a man who, for the first time in a very long time, had been made to reconsider what he thought he knew. Jalen didn't answer right away. Then, without turning, back. He gave a small, knowing smirk. He was already on that path. Outside the courthouse, the world was waiting. Reporters swarmed the steps like a wave. Cameras flashing, microphones pushed forward like weapons of another kind. Jalen, did you expect the judge to dismiss the case? How does it feel to outsmart the prosecution? Who trained? You? Were you coached? But Jalen didn't answer any of them. He pulled his hoodie over his head, tucked his hands into his pockets, and kept walking. He wasn't interested in being a headline. He didn't want to be viral. This wasn't about fame. It never had been. At the bottom of the steps, one person stood waiting, arms crossed, chin lifted, eyes brimming with a mix of pride and fury. Denise Dawson, his mother. She didn't move toward him, she didn't smile. She just stood still, looking at him like she was trying to memorize the moment, in case the world tried to erase it later. He reached her, and for a long second, neither of them said a word. Then finally she exhaled. Boy, she muttered, you scared me half to death. Jalen scratched the back of his head, grinning sheepishly. Had to take a risk, Ma. She didn't laugh. She just shook her head, then pulled him into a hug so tight he could barely breathe. You always were the stubborn one. Around them, the world spun. Reporters shouting, strangers watching, cameras catching every frame. But none of that mattered, because in that moment, it was just a mother holding her son. Across the street, another figure stood silently near a black town. Judge Grayson. His posture wasn't the same anymore. The stiffness was gone. So was the smugness. He wasn't holding a gavel now, just a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He watched Jalen but didn't call out again. He didn't need to, because the courtroom wasn't the only thing that had shifted that day. Something deeper had cracked. This case had been simple, on paper. Another file in a system that processed people faster than it processed truth. But now that system had been forced, for once, to look at itself, and it blinked. Jalen had done something most people never get the chance to do. He didn't just win, he revealed. He peeled back the curtain, made them see how quickly assumptions become convictions, how easily the wrong person can be made to fit, how dangerous it is when power stops asking questions. And most of all, he did it without raising his voice. He let the facts speak louder than the fear. Reflect on the bigger picture. Expand from one boy's case to a broken system. Emotional, thought-provoking, close. Across the street, Judge Walter Grayson didn't move. The courtroom was behind him. The chaos had died down. The cameras had turned away. But he remained, still, quiet, watching a young man walk down the steps with the calm of someone who had nothing left to prove. Jalen didn't glance back. Grayson didn't call out again, because this wasn't a moment for words. It was a moment for reckoning. For years, Grayson had seen defendants like Jalen come and go. Names on dockets, faces behind folders, black kids with blank stares, and public defenders who barely had time to learn their birthdays, much less their backstories. He had told himself he was fair, that justice was blind, that his court was balanced. But today, a 19-year-old had shattered that illusion, not with protests or outrage, but with logic, law, and something rarer, clarity. Jalen Dawson hadn't just defended himself. He had put the system on trial, and the system blinked first. Inside the courthouse, the stenographer still sat frozen at her desk, her fingers resting on keys she hadn't pressed in minutes. The bailiff stared at the empty defense table like it had betrayed him. Even Carrington, the polished, never-flustered prosecutor, was still gathering his files with the shakiness of someone who had just been disarmed by a child with a sharper mind than his degree. But this wasn't about embarrassment. It was about exposure. Because if Jalen hadn't known the law, if he hadn't dared to speak up, if he had just done what most defendants do, stayed quiet, trusted a tired system to sort itself out, he might be behind bars right now, charged, convicted, forgotten, because sometimes it only takes a fingerprint, or the color of your skin, or a judge in a rush for golf, or a prosecutor who stops asking questions. And suddenly your whole life is defined by a story you didn't write. Jalen had rewritten that story. But as he stepped into the sun, hoodie pulled low. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't soaking in the victory, because he knew what this win cost, and who wouldn't get to share it. He thought of the other kids sitting in holding cells across the city, kids without mothers who knew the law. Kids who couldn't quote court procedures or challenge inconsistencies. Kids who never got to ask, "Can we check the GPS?" They'd never have that moment, never see the system blink, because the system wasn't built for them to win. It was built to run, smoothly, quickly, quietly, and it nearly ran him over too. But Jalen knew the rules, knew how to challenge the rhythm without shouting over it, knew how to turn defendant into definer, and now he knew exactly what came next. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in, but next time, he wouldn't be standing at the defense table. He'd be standing in front of it, briefcase in hand, credentials earned, and eyes wide open, not just for himself, but for every kid who never got a second look. Jalen had made the system look twice, and it saw itself. The cracks, the bias, the laziness hiding behind routine, the assumptions dressed up as facts, and for once it couldn't unsee it. That's the power of knowledge, of preparation, of refusing to sit still when everything tells you to fold. That's the power of asking one question too many. So if this story made you stop, even for a second, if it made you question how many others were almost Jalen, or never got to be, don't let it end here. Share it. Speak it. Sit with it, because justice isn't a place you walk into. It's something you push for, pull toward, demand, even when your voice shakes. Jalen Dawson didn't just defend himself in court. He reminded us why the system was supposed to exist in the first place. And maybe, just maybe, he reminded it too,